In the last 2 to 3 years, we have seen competition grow in the planar magnetic headphone market. It used to be that Audeze was the only brand people would speak of when discussing planar magnetic headphones. But with Hi-Fi Man and Monolith, the product options have broadened and prices are a little bit more realistic. A few years ago, the Sendy Aiva was released and met with some positive feedback. I have already reviewed the Aiva and compared it against other headphones. But the Aiva still costs just around $600. The Aiva had its clones, the Blonde B20 and the Monolith M570 being the obvious ones. There is also the Sivga P2, a headphone that looks strikingly like the Aiva but costs a few $100s less. Sivga sent me the P2 to review. Is this a Sendy clone or a new product, and is it even worth considering? Sivga does not outright say that the P2 is a Sendy Aiva clone, but their marketing photos and statements are very similar, if not identical, to those found on the Sendy website. Sivga says that the P2 has comprehensive sound. They say that the frequencies are balanced very well and flow naturally. Sivga further says that the headphone has rich details and is transparent. I'm reading a bit of contradictory information here. On the one hand, Sivga says that the P2 has a balanced sound, but on the other hand, they say that the headphones are transparent. It has to be one or the other, not both. Sivga says that the P2 has wide soundstage. I guess we're just going to have to find out. The P2 has a robust metal build. It is a fairly weighty headphone, but considering all the materials used here, that's not surprising. The Sivga has wood ear cups, not wood accents, but actual wood. Sivga says that the P2 has solid walnut wood, and it certainly looks and feels that way. The ear cups have metal accents and machined vents, making this a semi-open headphone. The ear cups swivel 180 degrees in either direction. There is a physical stopper that prevents the ear cups from turning a full 360 degrees. The yoke and headband are metal and feel rather robust. I could not find any plastic pieces on this headphone. The headband is a suspension system. It is covered in fake leather. The padding itself appears to be memory foam on the headband, but small strips of them are evenly spaced around. The ear pads are angled and appear to have regular foam padding. These are replaceable. The P2 comes with a very large and sturdy case. The stock cable is also rather nice. It has metallic connectors. It transmits some microphonics. The cable ends in a balanced 4.4mm termination, but Sivga does include a 4.4 to 3.5mm adapter. Unfortunately, they do not provide a 4.4mm to 1/4-inch adapter. As for comfort, I find the P2 a fairly comfortable headphone. The ear pads fully sit around my ears. The clamping force is a little on the tighter side, but does not cause pain or significant pressure. The suspension headband evenly distributes the weight, and I can wear these headphones for 2 to 3 hours easily without fatigue. Overall, the P2 has excellent build. It's heavy and a bit bulky, but the construction is nothing to scoff at. The included accessories are sufficient and seem to be quality. If there's one thing to complain about, it's the lack of a 4.4mm to 1/4-inch adapter. Sure, you can connect the 4.4 to the 3.5mm adapter included in the box, and then add another 3.5mm to 1/4-inch adapter, but that is not particularly a welcome decision. Finally, I will emphasize that the P2 looks very similar to the Aiva. There are only minor differences. For example, the companies use different woods in the ear cups, and the headband on the P2 has padding, while the Aiva has none. In order to test the sound signature, I use the P2 with a number of neutral devices. I plug the headphones into my Modi 3 and Liquid Spark stack, the RME ADI2 DAC, the Low 2 Paw S1, and the Eco Zerta. I use the stock cable and ear pads. I played music using Amazon Music HD and listened to my test playlist. Some planar magnetic manufacturers will tell you how much power is required for peak performance. For example, Audeze and Avantone say that their headphones need 250 milliwatts. Monolith also suggests minimum requirements for some of their headphones. Hi-Fi Man, on the other hand, doesn't say anything at all. Neither Sivga nor Sendy Audio indicate how much power is required for peak performance for their headphones. In my experience, the P2 does get loud using the Eco Zerta. However, I believe that 200 milliwatts is probably the sweet spot for peak performance. Based on my numerous tests, I think that the P2 has slightly greater clarity and instrument separation with amplifiers that provide at least 200 milliwatts into 32 ohms. However, adding more and more power does not result in noticeably different performance. Consequently, if your amp has around 250 milliwatts into 32 ohms, that should be plenty of power for these headphones. Sivga doesn't really say what the bass response should be. However, my test suggests that the P2 has a sub-bass roll-off and a fairly neutral mid-bass. In Mountains by Hans Zimmer, the Sivga did present the rumble from the beginning of the song. However, that sub-bass detail was distant and recessed. Transients was fairly fast as well, faster than with the neutral Allo Audio S4X. When the crescendo hit at the middle of the song, the organ cut through the other instruments. The rolling thunder effect was audible but not powerful. All the instruments melded slightly, but I could differentiate among them upon close listening. When the vocals began singing at the end, they rose from the background until they were shoulder to shoulder with the instruments. In Conquer by Overwork, the Sivga recreated the rolling marble effect at the beginning of the track. This detail is supposed to pan from right to left to center, and the Sivga did present this panning, although the effect was not as obvious as with the Aventone Planar and the Austrian Audio Hi-X 65 and 55. There are multiple drums in this track, and all of them were clear. Their impact was hard, but decay was fast. Even with very loud volumes, the drums never sounded visceral or sharp. I listened to several hip-hop songs including Pure Water, New Patek, Reel It In, and Uproar. In all of these songs, the subwoofer was audible, but it sounded a bit distant, like it was at the other end of a large room. Transients was fast. The drums were more audible than the subwoofer, but not quite as impactful as they were on the Allo S4X. The vocals were clear and about 2 steps ahead of the instruments. I listened to Bim Bam Smash from the Bourne Supremacy soundtrack. This song has multiple drums, and the Sivga recreated all of them clearly. They all tended to meld slightly with each other, but retained their individual tonalities nonetheless. At 1 minute and 15 seconds, there's a pause and a hard drum strike timed to cars smashing into each other. The Sivga did recreate this drum strike, but it was a bit recessed. Overall, the P2's bass response is clear, but there is a noticeable sub-bass roll-off. This decrease in bass is similar to that of every other planar magnetic headphone I've heard, so it's not a surprise to find it on the P2. Mid-bass is close to neutral, though I think it too has a very marginal roll-off. There was never any muddiness or distortion. Sivga does not say exactly what the mid's response is on this headphone. However, I think that the P2 is slightly forward and sibilant, yet very clear in the mid's frequency. In Orla Gartland's song Why Am I Like This, natural grain and sibilance is mixed into the track. The P2 presented both details. The grain appeared to be fairly neutral, but the sibilance was elevated. There was slightly more sibilance than on the Allo S4X, but the P2 was not harsh. I find that the HD560S, for example, is incredibly harsh with the song, but the Sivga was at least 1 to 2 steps below that threshold. Orla's voice was about 2 steps ahead of the instruments. All the instruments were clear and seemed to have correct timbre. The backup vocalist sounded clear and was in the right ear cup, her voice separate from Orla's. In Want You Back by Haim, it was obvious that the P2 has a sibilance push. Again, this was not harsh as on the HD560S, but was more than on the Allo S4X. At 8 seconds into the track, the primary vocalist says the word "we" and drags it out, making it sound gravelly. The P2 recreated this detail perfectly. The 2 backup vocalists were clear and retained their individual tonalities, one in the left ear cup and the other in the right. When all the instruments played at maximum, I could still easily hear all 3 vocalists separately, which is something that not many headphones can do. The drums, piano, guitar, and bass appeared to have correct timbre, but the drums did have fast decay. In Superposition by Young the Giant, the Sivga P2 properly presented the ukulele and drums, but the bass was a bit recessed. The male vocalist was clear, and his sibilance was neutral and fairly smooth. There is a backup vocalist in this track, his voice layered underneath the primary singers. The P2 did present this detail, and in fact, I could hear the breathing of the backup vocalist as well. These are details that most headphones fail to present. Between 1 minute and 10 and 1 minute and 20 seconds, there are supposed to be sharp intakes of breaths. The P2 perfectly recreated this detail. I listened to several songs by the American folk singer Guy Clark. I listened to Maybe I Can Paint Over That, The Cape, and the guitar. Guy used acoustic guitars in all his songs, and he had a very gruff Marlboro Man type voice. The P2 clearly presented all of the guitars in his songs. I could easily hear several guitars strumming and there was no muddiness. Guy's voice did not have the full gruffness that it does on neutral headphones like the Allo S4X, however. Indeed, it seemed like his voice was missing some bass presence, making it sound less full. Overall, the P2 appears to have slightly forward mids, and female sibilance is accentuated. However, that sibilance push is not particularly harsh. If you are sensitive to sibilance, this may be an unpleasant experience. Instruments always sounded correct. Once again, Sivga does not say what the treble response is supposed to be for this headphone. Based on my tests, it appears that the P2 has very close to neutral treble. In Scherzo for X-Wings, the Sivga let the brass and horns cut through the other instruments without sounding harsh or piercing. These instruments retain their nasally sound signatures. Even beyond safe volumes, the P2 never sounded fatiguing. There was good separation among group sets, but I could not hear individual instruments. The P2 had depth, but not verticality. In other words, instruments appeared close or far, but never above or below. This was not a 3D effect. In Flight from the City, the P2 presented the piano as if it was about 8 feet away. The bassier notes had fast decay and lacked reverberation. The cello sounded smooth and clear with minimal melding with the piano. I could hear the electric buzzing and pops and sizzles. The creaking of wood in the pianist's bench and the shifting of the cello were easily audible. In Take 5 by the Dave Brubeck Quartet, the P2 presented the piano in the right, the drums in the left, the saxophone center, and the bass recessed behind everything. There was little melding among all the instruments, and it was easy to hear each. The saxophone was smooth and appeared to have correct timbre. I could hear the different tonalities of each successive cymbal strike as the cymbals were hit at different places. Finally, I listened to Luigi Boccherini's La Musica Notturna delle Strade di Madrid, as played by the Bremer Baroque Orchestra. This is a live recording in a stone cathedral. Unfortunately, the orchestra only has a YouTube recording of this track. Nonetheless, the P2 presented all the instruments clearly without distortion. The bass was recessed, but the other instruments appeared to have correct timbre. I could hear the plucking of violin strings, and the higher notes of the violins was never piercing. Overall, I think the P2 has a fairly neutral treble response. There is good clarity in this region, and multiple treble instruments can all be heard. The treble, even at high volumes, is never harsh or piercing. Sivga says that the P2 has rich detail. I'm not sure what that's supposed to mean, but my experience is that the P2 easily has above average detail retrieval. Obvious details are always present. Subtle details are usually easy to hear. There is never any muddiness or veiled signature. If a recording was properly made, then the P2 will present detail. Multiple vocalists are easy to hear with their individual tonalities. The plucking of guitar strings, shifting of the cello, creaking of wood, pops and sizzles, electric buzzing, multiple drums, and sharp intakes of breaths are all obviously present. For a more quantitative test, I used the song New Light by Kazuki. This track has layers of details, including the sound of children playing, wind, rustling of grass, synth, piano, and footsteps. I count the number of footsteps I could hear in the first 60 seconds. The Sennheiser HD800S presents 22 footsteps. The Focal Clear presents 18. The Austrian Audio Hi-X65 presents 16 to 17 footsteps. The Austrian Audio Hi-X55 presents 16. The Hi-Fi Man Sundara, Avantone Planar, and Beyerdynamic DT1990 present 10 to 11 footsteps. The audeze LCD1 and HD6XX present 6 to 7 footsteps. The Neumann NDH20 presents 5 to 6 footsteps. The Sivga P2 presents 10 to 11 footsteps. I use the HD6XX as the standard or average performance measure. A lot of people have the 6XX and can probably relate to its performance. With this as guidance, I think the P2 has above average detail and clarity, rivaling that of the Hi-Fi Man Sundara. Sivga says that the P2 has wide soundstage. The problem with saying a headphone has a particular type of soundstage is that others don't really have a reference, but I do. As with my detail test, the average measurement for me is the HD6XX. The 6XX to me has average soundstage. So does the LCD-1. The Neumann NDH20 has below average soundstage. The Audeze Mobius and all Beats headphones ever have claustrophobic soundstage. The hifi Sundara, Avantone Planar, Austrian Audio Hi-X 55 and 65 have above average soundstage. The hifi Diva has wide soundstage. The HD 800S has super wide soundstage. I think the P2 has above average soundstage. The P2 does not have an intimate presentation, but vocals are closer to the ears than instruments are. This headphone presents width but no verticality. Consequently, you will not hear a 3D effect unless it is manipulated through software. Sivga says a few contradictory things about the overall sound signature of the P2. At first, they say that the signature is balanced. Then they say that the headphone has a transparent sound. You really can't have both. I do not think that the P2 has a transparent signature, at least not if we define transparent as neutral. The sub-bass is rolled off. This is very similar to the performance of every other planar magnetic headphone I've heard, irrespective of the brand or price. The P2 does present sub-bass, but it sounds distant and a bit recessed. Moreover, the decay is rather quick. Mid-bass seems to be close to neutral, but not quite there. Drums never sound visceral or sharp, but they do sound fairly natural. In other words, some headphones make drum impacts very hard-hitting, almost like you're right next to the drummer. The One More Triple Driver and Audeze LCD XC have this type of performance. Other headphones make drums sound blunted or muffled, such as the Status Audio BT1. The P2, however, seems to take a middle ground. Drums never become fatiguing and do not rumble. Bass heads, beware. The mids are forward and clear. Vocals are about 2 steps ahead of instruments. Female sibilance is accentuated. It is slightly more than the sibilance on the Audeze 4X, but noticeably less than that of the HD 560S. Instruments tend to have correct timbre, and there is little melding among them. Treble is fairly neutral. Treble-centric instruments sound clear and have about as much energy as on the Avantone Planar's rendition of treble. The Audeze 4X has a bit of a push in the treble region, but the Planar is neutral. The P2's performance was similar to the Avantone Planar's in this respect. Treble was never harsh or piercing. The P2 has above-average detail and soundstage. Moreover, the P2 has good clarity throughout the frequency range. You won't hear a muddy or veiled signature. While I cannot say that the P2 is neutral or transparent, I have no problem concluding that the P2 has a balanced sound signature. Bass fans will be deeply disappointed, but those who prefer vocals and treble clarity should get their fix here. The P2's slight sibilance push may be problematic for some, but if you are sensitive to sibilance, then your choices for headphones is pretty limited anyway. I do not think the P2 does anything fundamentally different from other headphones. It does not break new ground. But the P2's overall performance and sound signature is nothing to laugh at. If this is the type of sound and performance you want, then the P2 is a viable option. I think reviewers should directly compare products whenever possible. That's the only way to put things into context. Consequently, I decided to compare the P2 against the Sendy Aiva, hifi Sundara, and the Audeze LCD2 Classic. I used a passive AB switch along with my new Sterling Audio SHA4. The SHA4 is a powered 4-channel headphone amplifier with independent volume control for each headphone output. I plugged my passive switch into my RME ADI2 DAC and also paired the SHA4 to the Soundcause LA QXD1. I volume matched all headphones to the best of my ability. I used stock accessories. I played music from Amazon Music HD. I have already reviewed all of these headphones, so I'm merely going to talk briefly about how each headphone compares to the P2. The Aiva appears to have a very similar bass response to the P2. Both headphones have a sub-bass roll-off, and after repeated A/B tests, I could not tell a difference in this respect. However, the P2 does have more mid-bass emphasis than the Aiva. Mid-bass impact is a little harder on the P2. Overall bass clarity is noticeably greater on the Aiva. In other words, the mid-bass sounds more full on the P2, and the Aiva's bass roll-off affects its mid-bass as well. The mids sound different on both headphones. The Aiva has greater sibilance than the P2. Voices have less bass presence on the Aiva. Vocals are a little bit more intimate on the P2. Instruments have similar timbre on both headphones, but the Aiva has a bit more separation among instruments. Treble is very similar between these headphones. However, I think the Aiva has just a little bit more energy and clarity. Neither headphone is peaky or harsh in this region. The differences I heard were not night and day, but only perceptible because of A/B testing. The Aiva has a bit more clarity throughout the frequency range, but it is not a dramatic difference. Indeed, although the Aiva does present slightly greater instrument separation, the P2's rendition is somewhat similar. Both headphones have similar soundstage and detail retrieval. The two most significant differences here are, number one, the P2 has slightly greater mid-bass emphasis and the Aiva is a little clearer in the bass region. And number two, the Aiva has a bit more sibilance and vocals are a bit further away than they are on the P2. The Sundara has slightly greater sub-bass roll-off than the P2. In fact, the Sundara's sub-bass sounds more muted and less obvious than it does on the P2. Decay, however, appears to be about the same. The Sundara's sub-bass roll-off is not significantly different, not dramatic in other words, but it is definitely noticeable with A/B testing. Mid-bass impact is very similar between these headphones, but the Sundara has more bass clarity and greater separation between sub-bass and mid-bass. Mid-bass impact is hard to distinguish between these headphones, but if I were to give an edge to one headphone, it would be the P2. The P2 has ever so slightly more bass impact. This could be due to imperfect volume matching despite my best efforts, so just keep that in mind. The mids are more neutral on the Sundara. Sibilance and vocal grain is closer to neutral on the Sundara, whereas the P2 slightly accentuates sibilance. Vocals are more intimate on the P2. In other words, voices are closer to the ears and more obvious on the P2. The Sundara, on the other hand, makes vocals sound further away, and sometimes they vie for attention among instruments. Instruments appeared to have identical timbre, clarity, and separation. Treble energy is hard to differentiate between these headphones. In fact, I would have to say that both headphones present treble instruments in a fairly neutral fashion. However, the Sundara does tend to add an odd timbre to horns and brass, making their notes resonate. Imagine talking through a running fan. Now, this is an issue I've noticed a few times on the Sundara. The P2 does not exhibit this. Regardless, other than this one oddity, the Sundara and P2 appear to have nearly the same treble response. Clarity and separation of instruments in this region is similar, but the instruments sound closer to the ears on the P2. Detail retrieval is very similar as well. Clarity sometimes is greater on the Sundara, but this usually happens when there are bassy instruments in the mix. Because the P2 has a slight bass emphasis compared to the Sundara, and because the Sundara has a bit more separation in the bass region, there are occasions with the Sundara when it appears to have slightly more separation among instruments. This, however, is not night and day, nor is it consistent. Soundstage is hard to distinguish, but the Sundara seems to have a marginally wider soundstage. The LCD2 Classic has a sub-bass roll-off similar to the P2. However, I think the Classic may just have a tiny bit less roll-off than the P2. The difference was remarkably small, but I consistently heard the Classic sub-bass with a bit more emphasis. Mid-bass is a little different. The P2 has a bit more bass impact. The P2 also has more separation and clarity between sub-bass and mid-bass. The P2's marginally greater mid-bass does not transform it into a bassy headphone in comparison to the Classic. Instead, it just appeared that the P2 merely provided a little bit more energy to drum strikes, and it was a little easier to hear multiple drums in a mix on the P2. The mids are different between these headphones. The Classic has greater sibilance and vocal grain than the P2. Vocals seem to be a little closer to the ears on the P2. Instruments always sounded the same on both headphones. Clarity in this region was similar. Treble is a bit accentuated on the Classic, while the P2 appears to be closer to neutral. The Classic has marginally greater separation of treble instruments, but clarity is about the same. Instruments appear a bit closer to the ears on the P2. The P2 provides more detail than the Classic. Separation of instruments and clarity throughout the frequency range is overall greater on the P2. Soundstage is very similar, though the Classic seems to have just a tiny bit more of it. Overall, it is evident that the P2 is not the same as any of these other headphones. Performance may be similar in some respects, but the sound signatures are not. The P2 and Aiva do not sound the same, though they do have a similar tuning. The Aiva has an airier presentation with a bit more clarity and separation, but in exchange, the Aiva has less bass and its mids sound less full and more sibilant. The Sundara has more neutral mids and similar treble response to that of the P2. However, the Sundara always presents elements in a mix further away, more distant than on the P2. Indeed, the P2 makes vocals and instruments sound more full and closer to the ears. The LCD2 Classic has more vocal sibilance and grain and a tiny bit more treble emphasis than the P2. The Classic has a slight edge in Soundstage, but its detail retrieval is less than that of the P2. The P2 has a bit more clarity and separation throughout the frequency range. None of these headphones may be to your liking, or perhaps you may enjoy one or all of these options and yet still not be happy. That's just the nature of something as personal as audio. What I want to emphasize is that you do not need to, nor should you, feel the pressure to buy audeze products to get good planar magnetic performance. Remarkably, paying less sometimes gets you more. If you look at the Aiva, Sundara, and P2, you'll notice that all three Chinese headphones have greater clarity, separation of instruments, and detail than the LCD2 Classic. However, all of these headphones have different sound signatures, and just because one has more detail or clarity than another does not mean that it is better. I don't know who owns Sendy Audio. Maybe Sendy is an OEM. Regardless, they are fairly new to the headphone market. Their Aiva did make a splash for better or worse. It underscored once again that Chinese manufacturers can make competitive planar magnetic headphones. Of course, Hi-Fi Man had been doing that for a while, but the quintessential shoddy Hi-Fi Man build quality has never been fixed, and apparently Hi-Fi Man does not care. Monolith has also been making planar magnetic headphones and had a few under their belt when the Aiva was released. But Monolith has been plagued by unproven claims of IP theft and have plenty of naysayers, warranted or not. So, Sendy Audio was a new face with new ideas in an old market. Sendy presented a very well-built headphone with premium materials. They charged a pretty penny for it too. At $600, the Aiva was not much less than a discounted LCD2 Classic. Sivga evidently took a lot of cues from the Aiva. The P2 shares a lot physically with the Aiva, and you cannot ignore the blatant similarities. By the way, Music Tech has a PDF linked on its Aiva and P2 sales pages, and that PDF suggests some differences that you may be interested in. Regardless, if you are hoping for a cheaper Aiva, maybe you have it here in the P2. These two headphones do not sound identical, and there are differences in regards to the meze response and clarity, but it is not as if you are listening to products from vastly different companies with dramatically different sound signatures. This brings us to value. Yes, I think you could argue that the P2 is value. Considering that the Aiva is $200 more expensive and the headphones have very similar but not identical sound profiles, the P2 may be a more reasonable purchase over the Aiva. But into this discussion, we should also talk about the Monolith M570. I reviewed the M570 last year and found that it sounds very similar to the Aiva, particularly if you swap the earpads. The M570 is $100 cheaper than the P2, so how is it possible for me to say that the P2 is value in light of the M570? Let's take a look at what you are getting. Assume for a moment that the differences in sound are minimal among these three headphones, the M570, Aiva, and P2. The Aiva at $600 is a tough pill to swallow. Yes, you are getting good build and accessories, but the price is steep. I'm not convinced that the Aiva at that price is value. The M570 has some notable issues. The build is robust, but comfort is lacking in my opinion. The M570's headband causes hotspots and the headphone feels heavier on the head than the Aiva, even though both headphones supposedly weigh the same. Further, the M570's accessories are a bit lacking. They're agreeable, but similar to what you get with cheaper products. I think the M570 can be value. If you can look past some of these issues, then it is a fair price. But for $100 more, the P2 does offer a more comfortable build and better accessories. You will have to judge if the P2 offers enough to warrant its additional price over the M570. So it appears to me that the M570, P2, and Aiva have very similar tuning. They are not identical, but they do come rather close. At this point, I would say that the Aiva is just too expensive to buy. If you liked its overall physical design, then the cheaper P2 has nearly identical design. If you want good premium accessories, then the P2 has that as well. If you just want an Aiva-type sound signature for the cheapest price possible, then the M570 is a viable alternative. However, I think the P2 is still missing a few things. For $400, I think Sivga should include a 4.4mm to quarter-inch adapter and a spare set of ear pads. I would also have preferred memory foam and real leather in the build. The Sivga P2 offers enough to arguably justify its price, but it's not the only Aiva-like headphone in the market. It is different enough in design from the M570 to stand apart, but it also is so similar to the Aiva that it's really hard, in fact foolish, to say that the Aiva is value in comparison to the P2. If you wanted the Aiva but could not convince yourself to spend $600, then the P2 may be something to seriously consider. However, I think Sivga should sell the P2 at no more than $350 in light of the M570's competition.